Welcome back to Mastering Change.
Today, we're joined by David Kessler, one of the world's leading experts on grief.
David has spent decades helping people navigate profound loss. In this conversation, he shares what grief really is and what it isn't.
We talk about sudden loss, anticipatory grief, regrets, presence, and how meaning is something we create, not something that we're handed.
It's a powerful, grounding conversation and one we're truly honoured to share.
Here's David Kessler. David Kessler, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast today. Thank you for joining us.
I'm so glad to be with everyone.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for being here. So as
Great to see you again. We saw each other and met for the first time when I was speaking at the amazing event with Astaire that all of you were involved in.
Yeah, we did. It was really nice to meet you there as well, especially as you're coming to Oxford now. So it was great to actually see you in person before then. So talking about Astaire, we start all of our podcasts with Astaire's card game, actually. And on these cards that I've selected, there is a prompt. The idea behind this prompt is that it will lead you into a short story about whatever the prompt says, and that'll help you connect to us and to connect to our audience. So it says, when I was younger, I thought the world was ...
Wow, what a start. When I was younger, I thought the world was dangerous and unsafe and hopeless. What a start there, right? I mean, I went right to it.
Absolutely. And do you want to talk about why you might have found
I had a very rough childhood. I was, I had a family that was very dysfunctional. My mother today would probably be considered bipolar. My father was deep into an addiction. I very much was the product of severe neglect. And on top of that, sexually abused by another family member. And then when I was 13, in this whole childhood that I went through, my mother was dying, and at the hospital across the street at the hotel where we were staying, there was a fire. Then they realized it's not just a fire, it's also a shooting. It's now considered one of the first mass shootings in the US. And so at such a young age, I experienced so much. And I really entered my teenage years feeling all those things I said. And I went on a quest to find some hope and healing. And that really brought me to my work and has helped me so much now to help others with grief and trauma and old wounds.
I think that's a really nice place for us to kind of transition into the lion's share of this conversation, which is how let's draw those dots between that kind of traumatic experience and grief and what you've learned through that lived and learned experience over the years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm so grateful to the work that so many people have done that you're going to have most of them, I would think, at Oxford. Between Bessel van der Kolk and Frank Anderson, who've done such incredible work on trauma. And I know from my work and background and childhood and research and academics and lived experience that all grief does not have trauma, but all trauma has grief. And I think many times people do such incredible trauma work, and clinicians are so trauma informed and really understanding it so much better. And people end up coming away, it's still not the life I want. I'm still don't, and they don't realize there was also grief work to do. You can't just do the trauma work without the grief work. So I think it's such a important component in the idea of what healing might look like.
And when you talk about grief work, what does grief work look like? How do you even start if you're a therapist and you're working with trauma but haven't got a background in grief? Where would you suggest that they start?
Yeah, it's interesting. I can speak well about the US that someone in the United States can become a therapist without one grief class. You can just be a therapist without ever having to learn about grief. And I think a lot of clinicians sort of know how to do that first session, the second session, and they don't know where to go from there. And the grief work is so much of that inner work. And I think one of the challenges is we live in societies that tell us to move on, get over it, have a stiff upper lip, don't think about it. And those feelings just get pushed down instead of experienced. And it is about experiencing those feelings. You know, I often talk about we can't heal what we don't feel. And so we have to really allow them. And that may be with the safety of a clinician to really go deep to understand it. You know, I often think about mourning is on the outside of us, it's what we do in the world. Grief is what's on the inside of us. So we have family pressures, society pressures to get back to life, to skip the pain. But the only way really out of the pain is through the pain. In my last book, when I was doing research, I looked into buffaloes. I never thought I would research buffaloes. And buffaloes, when they sense a storm coming, run into the storm, thereby minimizing the time they're in pain. Us human beings, on the other hand, feel that pain and want to run from it. That's our natural instinct. But we keep the grief 3 feet behind us for our whole life. And I think a big thing folks don't understand is they think, oh, yes, I haven't grieved. I suppose I got to go sit in a corner and cry. It's not even just about the sadness. It's about the anger, the betrayal, the unfairness, the jealousy, all of those feelings, and they impact our careers, our relationships. They're part of it all.
When people in a session, for example, talk about maybe the, the anger that they're feeling or all of these other kind of emotions, how, as a therapist, can you identify that I think this is grief that we're looking at rather than something else? What would you be say that's you can determine that that's the cause?
Yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes someone will be telling the story of what happened, and I'll actually pause them in that moment and I'll say, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Just want to pause and ask you how you're feeling as you tell the story. And I also get a lot of this information also from Paul Deniston that I work with. It's going to be there doing grief yoga and is all about the somatics of our body. I say, tell me what's going on in your body. And some people will say in that session, "Ah, I'm so relieved I never get to tell this story at home. I never get to say the story." And I'll go, I'm so glad you feel comfortable here. Please continue. But someone else might go, I'm feeling tense. My heart is racing. And I'll go, oh my gosh, let's pause there and come back to the story when you're more grounded. Because we really have to look at that trauma that might be there, that grief that might be there, those tears that need to be shed, the anger that needs to be expressed.
It's so interesting because what you described, that suppression of the grief, but that's the byproduct of lots of circumstances and situations. But it seems like in the kind of Western developed countries, we've suppressed, it starts with death. It's like these are the taboos that have now become really quite profound. And if you look to other cultures where actually there are somatic processes, there are things in community, there are ways of not having that suppression, but whether you've described it as a relief to be able to kind of talk about it, or as a fear of the kind of sensations and feeling that's coming up, I really recognize that real and people's expectation for you to move on, move round. There's lots of language there's so much language in popular culture that is encouraging exactly the opposite of what you're advocating for, which is to sit with.
And there's so much judgment. A lot of times I'll say to someone, wow, I'm hearing a lot of judgment. And they'll go, no, no, I'm not judging it. And I'll go, but you say you would be a wimp to talk about it, or it's silly, or why, someone said to me the other day, why open that can of worms? And I said to them, well, why live with an unopened can of worms? I mean, who wants to carry that around either?
Yeah.
And it's so interesting that, even when we talk about anger, I have online grief groups. I have 26 grief groups online. Sometimes I will demonstrate, and I often say, anger is pain's bodyguard. We see the anger first, but it's really pain. And I'll demonstrate releasing anger, maybe yelling or hitting a pillow. And people will say, I feel unsafe. And I'll go, we're online. Just a reminder, no one here can hit you or harm you. But here's the thing. So many of us saw inappropriate anger modeled that we don't even know how to express it in healthy ways.
Or realize that we need anger as well. Like, anger is a motivator. It's a driving force that as well, as long as doesn't turn into something dysfunctional or dysregulating, it's actually a useful emotion, like all emotions really. And I was thinking as you were talking, and especially as you were talking like Paul and the somatic work that you can use to help people move through grief, is it then that, you say all trauma comes with grief? If you do trauma work, can you do it at the same time as grief work? So if you're a trauma therapist that understands grief work, is it something that can work together and in like companionship with each other?
Absolutely. And I think it's important that clinicians who do trauma work know grief, and people who do grief work know trauma, that they do occur together. And we have to be able to stop and go, I think this is grief.
Mm.
I think this is grief. Let's pause here for a moment and talk about, wait a minute, you were sexually abused. Oh my gosh, the violation of that, the horrificness of that. But let's also stop for a moment and think about, wait a minute, you were robbed of a childhood. Oh my gosh, you've lost a sense of safety in your childhood. Those have to be grieved. We have to find the sadness around that. And all those other things, like, we used to think trauma was just an event that happened. Now we know it can be ongoing things like neglect, and to grieve that childhood you didn't get. Another place I see this coming up is sometimes people are grieving a parent, and maybe the parent had lots of issues, whether it's narcissism or addiction or their own wounds. Sometimes we have to really grieve for the parent we had. but we also have to grieve for the ideal parent we didn't get this lifetime that we wish we would have gotten.
I think that's a really important bit of education, though, that's needed, is how to recognize the hallmarks or the small marks, the subtle kind of the surfacing of that grief, because quite often in trauma it's complex and there's lots of things presenting. And so I think the more we can talk about, like you said, sometimes it's in the story that they tell and you making the pause to connect with how people are feeling. Are there other ways that our clinicians can spot that? Are there other kind of and then once they've spotted it, if they're not equipped to handle that, what do you think is like the natural next best step? You know, we talk a lot in this space about the importance of collaboration and cross-pollination between areas of expertise. So if we can, yeah, go again on how, you know, we've talked about one instance, but where else and how else do we look for it? And then what do we do with it?
Well, it's interesting, I bring my academic background to this, but I'm a bereaved child, I'm a bereaved parent. I understand this profoundly personally, as well as the work I've done over decades. And it is important. Clinicians are often really oriented around what interventions are we going to do. And then you get to grief, and grief is a moment to help clients sit, to just sit with all those feelings. And I often talk about grief is organic. You know, I always say I'm I'm teaching folks what our great grandparents knew how to do. I always remind people you come from a long line of dead people. Your psyche and soul is built to take a number of hits this lifetime, but we've lost that. And one of the big tenets is grief must be witnessed. Grief must be witnessed. We need our pain, our love witnessed in the eyes of another. I think of people's work like Edward Tronick, and we often think about the mirroring that babies and, parents do. And I remind everyone, we're former babies. We still have those mirroring neurons, and we need to be seen. And we see so much now. Trauma and grief cannot be healed in isolation. We need others to heal us.
Empathy and that compassion and being able to, I think that's another thing that's kind of, there's been we don't sit still, we don't sit uninterrupted, we don't sit in discomfort. And I've used this reference so many times on the podcast, but yin yoga for me was such an important, just the sitting in discomfort with just kind of being able to be present and aware of sensations and feelings, because everything's vying for our attention. And so that's a great way to say, actually, just sit with it. Don't try and
I mean, more than that, actually, I think what David was, correct me if I'm wrong, David was saying was like, it's the importance of the relationships that we have, that kind of that witnessing of the grief is like, whether that's a therapeutic relationship that we have, or whether that's kind of collective grief healing, which also in many other cultures that aren't such Western cultures, they have that kind of, there's, I don't know what cultures exactly they are, but they have like, months long vigils for grieving, where people get together in communities and they grieve and they wail and they do all of these kind of these grieving rituals, which we just don't have in the Western world, and I do think we are poorer for it.
But it's also about taking care, like in some cultures, the person who is grieving there'll just be a whole community that wraps around them, whether that's bringing them food, whether that's taking care, it's this sense of being held in that moment of suspension. I think it's the combination of the opportunity to sit in and with it and being supported in that. Well, that's what I was hearing when you were talking.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. By nature, I am a fixer. Oh my gosh, if you've got a problem, I will give you three possible solutions right here and now, whatever it is. I'm a fixer. And personally, I'm even working on it with my own therapist. I want things done. Like sit. I mean, that feels the most unproductive thing in the world. I'm arguing with my own theories here, but it's that idea of like sitting with it. And, even when I experienced my own loss years ago of my younger son, I've had the privilege of teaching with so many people. I, know Gabor and have taught with him and been to Bessel's work and all that. And so many people showed up for me, and it was their presence that mattered.
Mm.
It was their presence, not anything magical they said, but their presence. I mean, I can chat any day. I mean, I'm really lucky. I live in a world, where I can just chat about my son with Frank Anderson. I can remember going to my son's grave, and I had a phone call just as I was pulling out from the cemetery. And it's a dear friend of mine who's an accountant. And he said, "Hey, what are you up to?" And I said, "Oh, I'm just leaving my son's grave." And he said, "Still?" And I really had to work on, what if it's just a question? We live in a grief illiterate world. What if it's just a question?
Yeah.
And I calmed my nervous system down and I said to him, "Yeah, still, I might be doing it for the rest of my life. I actually get a lot of peace out of it. So, what are you up to?" And that was the conversation. And, he told me later he really learned from that.
I mean, it is so sad that people don't kind of, I don't know, like you say, don't understand the importance of life. And I think that's when you said that presence, that people just showing up. So many people, like that accountant, probably at the time would not have been. They don't know how to react. They don't know how to be. They don't know how to be just present without saying anything, without sort of telling you how to, you know, to have that stiff upper lip or go out for a run or whatever it is that they might think might help you get over the grief, but just sit with you, cry with you, or just not do anything, but just be there. And that's the kind of important thing that I think, you know, especially as I'm a fixer too. So sometimes I think, something, there's a problem, like a problem, something's happened, you want to go in and you want to fix it. Something when someone's died or there's someone's gone through an extreme like experience that has caused them grief. Nothing. There is no fix. There isn't.
Oh my gosh, a fixer like me
Yeah.
gets to grief and cannot do anything but be.
Yeah.
It is the fixer's challenge
Yeah.
because we have to hit a wall there.
Mm.
And it's interesting. I have had the privilege, and I'm going to be going there again to lecture in Australia. And one of the things when I was touring Australia years ago, a researcher came up to me and said, "I researched these very small villages. And one of the villages I go to shared that the night someone dies, the whole village has to move something in their home or in their yard." And the researcher said, "Why do you do that?" And they said, "Because the night someone dies, we want to make sure when the family wakes up the next morning, they look out and see that everything has changed
Yeah. So
now that their loved one has died."
mm.
In our Western culture, you wake up the next morning and everything's happening like nothing happened in your world, but you just had your world turned upside down.
Yeah. Yeah. It's beautiful that people do. That's the thing. That's the thing. I don't know. It's yeah. I wish we could learn from other cultures, somewhere, especially around grief. I think it's such and I think not only I mean, for me, the epitome of this whole like grief work was when obviously we have funerals in the Western world, and we do get together, and we do have some people live in nice communities that might come over and bring some food for the grieving person. If that's pretty much that's the best that we can do. That's all we kind of do. But like, and in COVID times, the funerals were stopped, and it wasn't even thought about like, oh, maybe this is our collective moment of healing and grieving together, and actually how important, what's the repercussions of this. It's just like, nope, that can't happen, so deal with it. And I just don't, I think it's very short-sighted of our
And it's interesting along those lines. Pre-COVID, my last book, the book, I have a workbook now, but before that was the book Finding Meaning. And when I was researching it before COVID, I would find people who were really stuck in their grief. I would say, tell me about the funeral. Now, this is pre-COVID, and I would say, tell me about the funeral. You know what? We didn't have everyone have a funeral. It was inconvenient. People are in different parts of the country or the world. And I'll go, well, where are they buried or cremated? Oh, I have their ashes. They're in the closet. I haven't figured out to do. And just like you said, I noticed people who were stuck, there was an absence of ritual. And this is prior to COVID. Then COVID hit, we really lost our rituals. And I hope COVID, one of the small bright spots was that maybe we learned to appreciate those rituals.
Mm.
The other thing I want to say that I think is important for clinicians to know is so many times people think grief and go, oh my gosh, who died? And they forget that grief is not always a death. Grief can be that neglect in the childhood, that abuse in the childhood, the breakup, the divorce, the job loss, the career change, the empty nest. In fact, I define grief as a change you didn't want. A change you didn't want. So it's really important. We have to understand every client we are going to see is going to be in grief in some way or have experienced it.
And that's a very liberating concept, because in all of those situations you've described, and many more where I can relate to that concept,
Yes.
the speed at which you're expected to kind of fly through that, and in a very often in an isolated way, because the job loss can mean a loss of community and connection to peers who you really respected and felt grounded with. And I think just kind of coming back as well to that point about how people show up for one another in those moments. It was that in that conversation you had with the accountant was like you say, but if we don't have those conversations, always think it's better for someone to show up and say something wrong than just to not show up at all. I can remember when my mum was diagnosed with cancer, one of her best friends was just AWOL, but and she just genuinely didn't know what to say or what to do or how to be there. Actually, all that person needs is the presence, the continuity, the connection. But I hadn't specifically thought about it in the context of grief. And we talk about community and connection so much in this world about that's how healing happens. But yeah, I can see how that's a kind of foundational piece. And in that therapeutic intervention, being able to create, if you've got that relationship, being able to be that for the.
And in our modern world, we have so much awareness of boundaries and understanding of relationships. But sometimes, because we're so grief illiterate, I have seen people throw incredible relationships away and go into estrangement because the person said the wrong thing. And we're so raw and we're so tender, and our system just can't take it. And if you don't have a clinician that understands how to help you do that repair work, my website, I'm very lucky years ago, I got grief.com, and I watch the analytics and I watch where people go on it. The most visited page on my website is the best and worst things to say to people in grief, because we literally don't know.
Mhm.
We just don't know. No one teaches us what to say. You know, I remind people, don't ever begin a sentence with "at least."
Mm.
Oh, you're unhappy with your divorce? Well, at least you don't have to deal with that person. Oh, your mom died? Well, at least it was quick.
Mm.
All those things are minimizing and shut our feelings down. And people don't understand that they leave us alone emotionally.
Yeah. And I think we've got, like, all of us have got so much to learn when it comes to grief. I mean, I've got just like you say, it's like it's thinking about. I really appreciated you saying, you know, it's not just death when we think about grieving. It is all of those other kind of. I liked what you said about it's the thing that we don't want that happens to us, right? And it's then grieving that emotional upheaval that we've got to, whatever it is that we might have lost or we might not have achieved or we might not have got, and it could be small. And I guess, like trauma, sometimes if these things are happening a lot to us, then they kind of build up as well. They mount up and they mount up, and they can kind of weigh heavily if we've got no tools to work through them.
And it's interesting. I'll give you such a clear example of that. My mother dying, you know, any clinician I would see, it's so easy for me to walk in and go, you know, I'm in my 20s and 30s at the time. I'm so unhappy in my life. Get my history. Well, your mother died. That's it, you know? And let's just talk about that. And I bet it was traumatic and a shooting and all that. And we do that. But here's the thing, I go on in my life because I really didn't do that deep pain of grief and allowing it. I went on to have every relationship that I could with huge abandonment issues. I mean, a healthy relationship. Oh my gosh, if someone told me, "Oh, that person, they're, you know, they're not relationship oriented. He or she's never going to be involved." I'm like, "Let me meet them." Because I was so attracted to the people I couldn't get, because I was living my life out of my grief. And
Yeah.
I was going to find that person, whether it was a relationship, a friendship. I was going to find, you know, women with huge personalities and strong women who were maybe going to fill the hole left by my mother. And until I really went deep into that grief and understand those are all projections, those are all reenactments, I have to fully grieve. My mother existed between these years once in this lifetime, and there can never be no replacements.
Mm.
Then
Yeah.
I found freedom.
But also that all of those other relationships that you went for, those women, those with that wouldn't treat you right, that were gonna abandon you, and that were etc. They were gonna you were adding grief on grief, because every time those relationships broke down, there was just another kind of, it's like this, that adding trauma upon trauma, adding grief upon grief, and it's this constant build up until you do the deep work. And then by the time you're able to do the deep work, you kind of got to unpick all of these layers of years of other stuff that's just gone on top, right? That's
And to realize whenever I'm projecting my pain of grief onto someone else, not only am I not actually seen in that reenactment, I don't really see them for who they are.
Mm.
So I miss that amazing person because I think they're too boring. I miss, you know, but I don't see this other person as such a narcissist. I mean, there's all those things that are happening in all that.
Yeah. Yeah. So it just shows how important it is to do that work, right? And just how important it is for the clinicians to kind of really understand that, as you say, every trauma will carry grief. And so if you're doing trauma work, you need to be able to do that grief work and do that in whichever way your clients need. Fascinating conversation. Do you want to?
Really, really great conversation. I could keep going because I just that whole 6th stage and meaning and the post-traumatic growth bit. I think just before we wrap up, I would just love to go there because you kind of had this pioneered this 6th stage of grief, the finding meaning, which can feel very overwhelming and probably inaccessible to people in those early stages. But I think the parallels with post-traumatic growth is so, or it is a version of post-traumatic growth. I just wondered if we can just briefly touch on that before I ask the final question.
What you just said is so important because we are talking about, oh my gosh, when I first heard about meaning, when I was in my grief, I like threw the paper down. I had no interest. People early in grief, oh my gosh, meaning is like the anti. So I really wanted to look into, even after my own son died, what happens? Is it just years later I find acceptance and that's it? And I wanted more, and I was so privileged to work with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and work with her on the stages to adapt them formally from death to grief. And I will tell you, I saw so many years of the stages being misinterpreted, and people tried to make them neat and tidy and linear, which was never Kubler-Ross's teaching nor mine. And they're just one model. There's no right model. There's no one right way to do grief. But in my own experience, I eventually wanted more. And that's what meaning was. And I think the confusing thing about meaning and grief is when people hear finding meaning, if it's too early, it feels like pressure. You've got to get to somewhere good, which I'm a big believer. You have to walk through the pain and the valley. There's no rushing to the good. I wish there was. I would have done it myself, but there isn't. People get confused. They think the meaning, when they hear that, they go, there's no meaning in a child's death, in a murder, in a horrible divorce, in sexual abuse, in neglect. And I will always say, of course not. The meaning is not in the horrible event. It's who we are afterwards. It's how we heal. It's who we become. It's how we rebuild. It is that post-traumatic growth that's so important. And I think, when I was really honored when the Kubler-Ross family and foundation allowed, the publisher to call it the 6th stage, it really means a lot and touched me. And it was a chance for me to go back and clear up so many misunderstandings about her work.
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay, David, so I'm going to ask you the same question that we ask all of our guests. So let's zoom right out and look at the macro context, the geopolitical unrest, the climate crisis. There are many reasons to be concerned about what's happening in the big picture. Then if we kind of come down to societies, which are the dynamics of societies are changing, accelerated by technology and perpetuated by that bigger picture, then we come into kind of communities and the demise of community and connection for many reasons. All of these kind of factors are compounding to create fractured and fraught relationships in that context. And then we come down to, your family, your friendship group, your work colleagues, your significant other, your children, and the relationship that we have with ourselves. And there are so many reasons to be fearful, angry, concerned, all of these emotions that are big and hard to cope with. If you had a single lever for the kind of change that we need to see, a button that you could push, what would that be?
Great question. Great question. And I came right to my own answer. I think all these things that happen in our personal lives, in our bigger world, in the global sense, with our trauma, with our grief, with our life, we often feel a loss of power. So if I could push one button, it would be remembering I have power.
Lovely.
Beautiful. David, it's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast today. I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. You know, it's an important one that not a lot of people go there for very long, but there is a lot of hope in the way that you describe grief, the process, and the role that we can all play in holding each other through it. So thank you for your time today.
Oh, well, thank you both. And that's really how I feel, and what's the essence of what I want to teach, that we in this lifetime go through really terrible things. And no matter what you've been through, there is hope. There is the possibility of happiness and healing. And I hope with all the things I've been through personally and have seen professionally, that I'm evidence for others that that's not just a theory, but possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, David. And I'm really looking forward to welcoming you in Oxford in September. Can't wait.
Me too, very much so. Thank you.